December 2023 marked a turning point for Argentina, a country standing at the edge of an economic abyss, with inflation screaming past 211% annually, interest rates strangling businesses at 126%, and nearly half the population drowning in poverty while the peso collapsed and shelves emptied, forcing families to make impossible choices between food and electricity every single day. Then they elected a man who promised to blow up the entire system, Javier Milei, a libertarian economist with wild hair and even wilder ideas, who won with 56% of the vote by promising radical surgery with no anesthesia, pledging to cut public spending by a third, fire tens of thousands of government workers, devalue the currency, and let the free market decide who survives and who doesn't. Critics called him reckless and dangerous. Supporters called him Argentina's last hope. And nearly a year into his presidency, the results are absolutely shocking. Nothing like what either side expected or predicted when he took that oath of office. When Milei officially took office in December 2023, Argentina wasn't just struggling or going through a rough patch. It was literally imploding from the inside out, with inflation running at 211%, annually making it the highest rate on planet Earth, while interest rates had hit an absolutely suffocating 126% that killed any chance of business growth or investment. And the country's GDP was shrinking, with a brutal recession gripping the nation at negative 1.6%, meaning over 45% of Argentinians were living in poverty, and nearly 18% were classified as living in extreme poverty, surviving on less than $2 a day. This was a country on the brink of total collapse, teetering on the edge of becoming a failed state. And Milei didn't waste a single day or even a single hour once he took power. His reforms came fast and brutal, like a sledgehammer to the system, with public spending slashed by 30% in real terms almost overnight. Subsidies for public utilities like electricity, gas, and water drastically reduced without warning, causing households in Buenos Aires to see their utility bills explode from just 5% of actual costs to as much as 30% in a matter of weeks. And for many families already struggling to put food on the table, this was an absolutely crushing blow that pushed them even deeper into poverty. Inflation, which was already spiraling completely out of control like a rocket ship headed for the sun, peaked at a mind-boggling 290% by April 2024, while food prices, literally the lifeline for any family trying to survive, rose faster than they had in over 3 decades, with food inflation hitting 300%, forcing parents to buy single bananas instead of bunches, single tomatoes instead of kilos, and single eggs instead of dozens, because that's all they could afford. The central market in Buenos Aires reported a devastating 40% drop in sales of fruits and vegetables, not because people didn't want to eat healthy food, but because they simply had no money left after paying for rent and utilities. So they were eating less, not by choice but by necessity, surviving on rice and pasta while their children went to bed hungry. But then something absolutely remarkable happened that nobody saw coming. Not the economists, not the politicians, not even Milei's own team. Because inflation began to cool down significantly and dramatically. By October 2024, overall inflation had dropped to 193%, which is still the highest in the world by a massive margin, but represents a significant reduction of nearly 100 percentage points in just 6 months. An achievement that most economists would have said was completely impossible. While food inflation followed a similar trajectory, falling to 183% and giving families at least some small relief from the crushing pressure. Now, to put this into proper context so you understand just how insane these numbers are, the next highest inflation rate globally was Syria at 120%, a country literally torn apart by civil war, followed by South Sudan at 107%, another war-torn nation. So the drop was dramatic and unprecedented, but still far from sufficient to ease the pain and suffering for everyday Argentinians who were still struggling to survive day by day. Interest rates became another major focal point of Milei's aggressive reform agenda, and he inherited the world's highest official interest rate at an absolutely staggering 126%. A rate so high, it made borrowing money virtually impossible for small businesses and individuals. Over the course of just 1 year, those rates were cut 7 times in rapid succession, landing at 35% by November 2024, which made Argentina more competitive internationally and removed it from the shameful top spot in global interest rate rankings, a position now held by Venezuela with rates exceeding 59%. And these changes signaled improving economic conditions and growing stability. But for ordinary Argentinians living paycheck to paycheck or day to day, the road to real stability and prosperity still seemed impossibly long, like climbing a mountain with no peak in sight. One of the most controversial and heavily criticized measures Milei implemented was the massive devaluation of the peso, because when he took office, the peso was trading at 370 per US dollar on the official government-controlled market, but closer to 800 on the black market where ordinary people actually exchange their money. In an effort to unify these wildly different rates and stabilize the currency once and for all, Milei devalued the peso significantly and dramatically, and by July 2024, it hit an all-time historical low of 1,200 pesos to the dollar, making imported goods astronomically expensive overnight. Yet by November, the peso had recovered slightly to 1,135 pesos on the black market, a modest improvement that reflected rising market confidence and growing trust in Milei's economic plan. But despite these dramatic measures, Argentina's heavy reliance on imports continued to strain and weaken its economy because the country pays far more for imports than it earns from exports, creating a massive structural weakness that Milei sought to address by focusing on the country's massive untapped natural reserves. Argentina holds the second-largest shale gas reserves in the entire world and the fourth-largest shale oil reserves globally, resources that could transform the country into an energy powerhouse if properly developed and managed. Shale gas production jumped dramatically from 80 million cubic meters per day in 2022 to 2023, 100 million in 2024, and projections suggest it could exceed 240 million by 2034 if investments continue. While shale oil production has also surged impressively, reaching 400,000 barrels per day, with the potential to hit 2 million barrels per day within a decade. However, extracting these valuable resources will require an estimated $58 billion in investment, a truly massive challenge that Milei aims to overcome through aggressive foreign partnerships, tax incentives, and deregulation that makes Argentina attractive to international energy companies. Milei's brutal austerity measures extended far beyond simple public spending cuts, reaching into every corner of government and society with over 30,000 public sector jobs eliminated in 2024 alone, and plans to cut another 40,000 positions by the end of 2025, while public infrastructure spending dropped by a staggering 90%, completely freezing projects from hospitals to transport systems to schools. These harsh measures contributed to the country achieving its first fiscal surplus in 15 years, a historic achievement that hadn't been seen since 2009. And from January to June 2024, Argentina reported monthly budget surpluses, a stark and dramatic contrast to the massive deficits that had plagued the country for over a decade. However, this fiscal success came at an absolutely steep human cost, with unemployment rising to 8% and informal sector workers, who represent nearly half of the entire workforce, left completely without social protections, health care, or retirement benefits. The housing market experienced its own massive upheaval when Milei repealed rent control laws in December 2023, leading to a 170% surge in housing availability in Buenos Aires and a 40% drop in rental costs by mid-2024 as landlords who had been holding properties off the market suddenly listed them. Rental listings shot up by 184%, alleviating some of the severe housing shortages that had plagued the city for years. But for existing tenants who were already locked into contracts Rents tripled in many cases almost overnight, and coupled with rising utility bills that had increased by 500% or more, housing remained a significant and crushing burden for millions of families. Let's talk about poverty, which is arguably the most heartbreaking and devastating statistic in all of this economic transformation. Because by mid-2024, over 53% of Argentinians were living below the official poverty line, up dramatically from 45% the previous year, while extreme poverty affected nearly 18% of the population who were surviving on less than $2 per day. Public transport fares increased sevenfold in just 6 months, forcing many workers to abandon their commutes entirely and either quit their jobs or walk for hours to get to work. While food prices soared to the point where customers began buying single bananas, single tomatoes, and single eggs instead of buying in bulk because that's all their money could stretch to cover. Despite these absolutely grim and depressing numbers, there are genuine signs of hope emerging from the chaos. As Argentina's agricultural sector, which is a vital component of its economy and identity, rebounded strongly after years of underperformance caused by price controls and export restrictions. Exports of soy, corn, and beef picked up significantly, contributing to a rare trade surplus that brought foreign currency into the country, while in the energy sector the country's risk premium, which is a key measure of investor confidence, fell dramatically from 2,500 basis points in December 2023 to just 750 points by late 2024, signaling growing trust and optimism in Argentina's economic recovery. Public sentiment remains deeply divided along political and economic lines, with Milei's approval rating standing at 47% in November 2024, up from 43% the month before, and while many critics harshly condemn his austerity measures as cruel and unnecessary, others see them as a necessary evil to finally stabilize an economy that had been spinning out of control for decades. His supporters point to reduced inflation, falling interest rates, and budget surpluses as clear evidence that his policies are working and producing results, albeit slowly and painfully. Milei's approach to international relations has been surprisingly pragmatic and strategic, and despite his fierce libertarian rhetoric about sovereignty and independence, he renegotiated a $5 billion currency swap with China to bolster Argentina's dangerously low reserves. At the same time, he aligned closely with incoming U.S. President Donald Trump to secure favorable terms for crucial debt renegotiations with the International Monetary Fund, because Argentina owes a crushing $14 billion in debt repayments for 2025 alone, making the country heavily reliant on international assistance and goodwill from creditors. As Argentina moves into 2025, the critical question remains unanswered. Will Milei's radical and controversial reforms lead to sustained economic growth and prosperity? Or will the severe social costs prove too high and trigger a backlash that destroys everything he's built? The numbers tell a complex story of genuine progress mixed with profound and devastating hardship, because inflation has come down dramatically from record highs, interest rates have stabilized at manageable levels, and foreign investment is slowly trickling back into the country. But for millions of ordinary Argentinians trying to survive and feed their families, daily life has become significantly more difficult and painful, with over 10,000 businesses closing permanently in 2024 alone. And consumer spending has yet to recover to pre-crisis levels because people simply don't have money to spend. The stakes couldn't possibly be higher for this struggling South American nation, because Argentina has a once-in-a-generation chance to reset its economy and break free from its decades-long cycle of boom and bust that has destroyed the middle class. But it will require an incredibly careful balancing act between fiscal discipline and social equity, between economic growth and human welfare, because if Milei pushes too hard, the social fabric could tear apart completely. For now, Javier Milei's presidency is a radical experiment being watched by economists, politicians, and millions of people around the world. An audacious and unprecedented attempt to rebuild a nation's economy, one painful statistic at a time. His critics warn loudly that the human cost is far too high and that he's destroying lives to save spreadsheets, while his supporters argue passionately that without this radical surgery, Argentina would have died on the operating table anyway, bleeding out from decades of corruption and mismanagement. The truth is, we won't know who was right for years or maybe even decades. But one thing is absolutely certain beyond any doubt. Argentina will never be the same country it was before Milei took power, for better or worse, and the world is watching to see if this gamble pays off or ends in catastrophic failure.